Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour Quarantined. We've been doing these nightly since we've been in lockdown. And as of today, we know that that's going to be lasting at least another 3 weeks. That was announced by Dominic Raab at the 5 p.m. press conference. Tonight, I'm giving Aaron a night off, and I'm delighted to be joined from the US by Meagan and Micah Uetricht. Micah is managing editor at Jacobin, and Meagan is a staff writer there. Tonight, we're going to be discussing their brand new book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We were doing, just before we went live, I had to have a sort of quick 2-minute break to go and do the 8 p.m. Clap for the NHS that we do every Thursday. So I was just asking you if you do that in the United States, because I mean, something that has been very profound in this country really during the whole coronavirus crisis is this sort of outpouring of love for the National Health Service. You know, people can be critical of it in ways that it's sort of like the Tories trying to reappropriate the NHS when they've cut it for 10 years. But, you know, in many ways, it's lovely. It's people rallying around a social democratic institution. I mean, do you have clapping for healthcare workers, even though you don't have a National Health Service? Is there the same sort of worship of healthcare workers and hospitals, even if they're privately owned?
I don't think it's quite as strong. I know that there's clapping in some cities, but yeah, I mean, the idea that the NHS is a single institution, not just this abstraction called healthcare workers or frontline healthcare workers or essential workers, I think that it probably lends to a stronger outpouring of affection in the UK than we're seeing here in the US.
Well, I think what we have is, you know, as in the UK, you all would be like, yay NHS. We are like, yay frontline healthcare workers, despite the fact that you work in this horrible system that makes your life incredibly difficult and makes it so hard for everybody else to get care. Like, we recognize that you, the frontline nurse and the doctor, are really doing heroic work. So it's for the individuals rather than for the institution, which everyone hates.
Yes, but to be honest, I mean, our clapping is for the individuals, because even though, yeah, the NHS is great, we know that these people are getting sent to work without adequate protective equipment, etc. So you know, there's also that sort of clapping for you, because we know this kind of sucks. You're both in lockdown though. I like to get a sense of what's going on, given that we're in extraordinary times whenever I get anyone on the show from a different place. So in East Bay, California, Meagan, when was the last time you left the house?
I've been going, actually spending a little more time outdoors, very far away from other individuals, enjoying trails near my house I didn't even know existed before. But it's been a while since I socialized with somebody who wasn't my partner.
Nice. If you did that in the UK, you'd have a drone following you, and then the local police force would share the video to shame people walking too far from their homes.
Is that really happening?
Well, there was a very famous incident of Derbyshire police who went to the Peak District and with a drone, and then shared on Facebook people watching the sunset and saying, this is not essential. You're not supposed to do non-essential walks.
Wow.
And you're also in lockdown, Micah.
Yeah, I went to the grocery store the other day, and it was a very bizarre experience. Fully masked up with gloves on, you know, waiting in a line, socially distanced properly. That was about the only exposure to the outside world that I've had recently. And the walls of my apartment are really starting to like come in on me. I'm being driven slowly mad, as we all are, I think. Yeah,
and it's screwed up your book tour, right? So when was your book released? Last week?
I mean, I don't like to complain about this because it's like, you know, people are dying in massive numbers. So I feel a little bad complaining about a book tour that is not happening. But yes, the book was released 2 weeks ago. We dropped it about a month early, and we were going to go all over the US, and we're going to come to London, to the UK, to Ireland, to all over Europe probably, and all that's on hold. So we'll see what ends up happening there. We've been doing a lot of Zoom calls, as most people are in this quarantine. And you know, it's a poor substitute for the real thing. I'm an extrovert. I like to be talking to actual people in real life. But you know, we did a Students of Bernie call last night, and it definitely made us feel a lot better about the state of the world, even though it was mediated through Zoom.
And thank you for everyone who is watching this evening. As you know, we always like to get as many people as possible watching these streams live. So please share the link on Twitter and tweet on the hashtag TiskySour. Let's go into the book. So the book gives a background to Bernie's politics and then describes how his candidacies in 2016 and 2020 have helped create almost out of nothing a large and dynamic socialist movement in the US. And you lay out your theory of change. We'll be talking about that as we go through the show. And the subtitle of the book, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, luckily didn't require Bernie Sanders to win to get from one of those things to the other. So the Bernie campaign leading to democratic socialism didn't need him to become president. Of course, otherwise the book would have had a rather short shelf life. I want to start with sort of a broad question, which I think frames your book. We'll get on sort of later to why Bernie Sanders wasn't successful in becoming president this time around, which is what is the legacy of, in particular, the 2020 Bernie campaign when it comes to, you know, the popularity of socialism in the United States and its legacy in terms of organizing.
Yeah, we have only one chapter in the book about Bernie himself, but it's important to have that chapter because Bernie has played this really singular role in transforming the political possibilities in the United States. I mean, if you think back just, 4 or 5 years ago, before Bernie's first campaign was launched, the socialist movement was in complete isolation. Mainstream media were not talking about socialism. There was no reborn socialist movement through the Democratic Socialists of America. There were only a very small handful of left legislators, maybe depending on how you count, just one, Bernie Sanders, in the Congress. Actions like labor action, strikes and union rates were dropping like a stone and seemingly only getting worse. The world before Bernie was pretty bleak. And of course, there were fightbacks going on in the labor movement, in social movements and elsewhere. But overall, the left was completely marginalized in American life. And at this point, we are not. We just lost the second run at becoming the most powerful figure on the face of the earth. And we lost, which maybe could have been predicted given how well guarded that fortress is. But in Bernie's running for president, he helped unleash this whole set of new political possibilities, the most important of which is he showed that the argument that we've heard for decades in this country, which is that Americans are somehow uniquely allergic to socialism, uniquely allergic to class struggle, and that so if you wanted to do progressive politics, you kind of had to soft pedal what it was that you were arguing for because Americans would be scared off by the S word. He's shown that that's not true. He got millions of people excited about his campaign. In the first primary, tens of millions of people voted for him. And he's also unleashed this whole constellation of socialist electoral energy and social movement energy, and played a role in stoking union labor militancy in the country. So we come out of these two campaigns with a really transformed political landscape, and we don't want to overstate the case. Obviously, we lost badly, and the world is a much worse place for our losing, and we should parse why and how we lost. But we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that I think in the long run, his two campaigns will be seen as radically transforming American politics.
Let's actually, I'm sure we'll keep coming back to the legacy of the Bernie campaigns throughout the show. We probably should, talk briefly about why he lost. And I wanted to bring up a quote from the book to see if there's been any reassessment of it. So this is graphic one. Americans are not excited by and thus are not driven to vote for candidates who defend the status quo. Now, Joe Biden, if anything, is the epitome of a candidate who stands for the status quo. In fact, he was quite open about that. But when the race came down to a one-on-one race between him and the change candidate, the radical candidate, people came out quite strongly for him. So I'll go to you, Meagan, because I know you spent a lot of time on the ground organizing during this primary election. Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, that we at Navarro as well, underestimated the enduring appeal of third way centrism?
Yeah, the thing that bears reassessment is the clause driven to vote for. I maintain that, I talked to hundreds and hundreds of people in the lead up to this election. People are in fact not excited by candidates who represent the status quo. Nobody is excited by Joe Biden. Not even centrists are excited by Joe Biden. They're terrified of Joe Biden. They see him as an extremely flawed candidate. They did not want to line up behind him early. They cast it about for some alternative, and every alternative just didn't seem to work out, didn't seem to pass muster. And ultimately, at the very final hour, they consolidated around Joe Biden, who they had been very reluctant to prop up throughout the campaign. And people voted for Joe Biden for a lot of reasons. One of which is this phenomenon that we've been seeing more and more, which is that people, as people have become demoralized, politically demoralized, they've started to see themselves as political pundits rather than political actors. So they see their responsibility as a voter as being to predict what other people want, and then to make sure that they make a responsible vote based on that prediction. I think this is driven in large part by the media and the sort of dominance of horse race speculation. And also there's a very explicit message to this effect that's coming from the centrist media. Joe Biden is the electable candidate. We have to put somebody electable up against Donald Trump. And it's just completely... It's a completely self-fulfilling prophecy. It's self-reinforcing, because if you look at the poll numbers on enthusiasm for Joe Biden, it's like, 20-something% of the Democratic Party base is actually proactively enthusiastic about Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders has consistently had the highest favorables across the board, and he didn't actually win the vote, which means that there's some sort of differential between what people are excited about and what people feel that they have a responsibility to do as voters. And I also want to point out that the Democratic Party electorate, the primary electorate, is a different animal from the general electorate. About 4 times as many people pay attention to presidential politics when it's a runoff between 2 candidates, a Democrat and a Republican. The people who are paying attention to Democratic Party primary politics tend to be party loyalists by nature, and they tend to be more conservative because they're afraid that their party is going to lose in comparison to the other party. And so they have this kind of calculus going on in their head, which is, how can we preserve the integrity of our party, which is locked in struggle against the other party? And that doesn't create quite as much space for us to advocate for our politics, which are pretty antagonistic to the party establishment and require a little bit of taking a risk in order to ultimately be successful. I think that our politics would have been more successful in a general election than in a primary election. I thought that going in too. I don't think the nuance is reflected in the quote that you selected, but driven to vote for and excited by it. Turns out there's a gulf between those things, and ultimately that's possibly the best way to explain why and how we lost this election.
And does that then speak to, I suppose, an error that the Bernie Sanders campaign made by not focusing enough on electability and focusing too much on the strengths of the policy program that Bernie Sanders was putting forward, for example, compared to Elizabeth Warren's? So he had the perfect Medicare for all policy, but he sort of didn't talk enough about the fact that actually you can feel comfortable voting for me because I'm not going to easily get defeated by Donald Trump. Should that, in hindsight, have been a much bigger emphasis of the campaign? Well,
Elizabeth Warren, part of her pitch was that she was a slightly more electable candidate than Bernie Sanders, and of course, she never took higher than 3rd in any of the primaries. So, when you start having this kind of conversation, should he sort of made the electability pitch? Usually, the way that gets interpreted is that you need to kind of attack more towards the center, and that is something that that Warren did and failed, but also that Bernie was constitutionally incapable of. But because he refused to tack towards the center, because he refused to water down his message at all, he's also played a transformative role in politics by planting the flag of a kind of bold left-wing politics and refusing to go to the center to try to get more people on board, which maybe it helped result in him losing this election, maybe not. But our hope is that over the long term, that kind of planting of a flag will help those left-wing policies take hold among the American electorate in the years and decades to come.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to quite a specific argument that you make in the book about how socialists should relate to the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. It's sort of evocative of things that people are talking about in the UK right now, since we've just had a big leak about how the degree and the extent to which apparatniks, sort of like at the top of the party, were actively trying to undermine the possibility of winning an election on a socialist platform in this country. So many people are sort of saying it's time to leave the Labour Party. I think overwhelmingly the dominant position is to stay within it. But I want to go to another quote from your book, from the chapter or the section on the dirty break. We argue for an approach to the Democrats that is willing to use the party's ballot line, preventing us from being doomed to complete political irrelevance, whilst laying the foundations for an eventual break with the party to create a future workers' party, what has been called a dirty break, as opposed to a clean break strategy. So I'll suppose, I've got some questions about how, or some, concerns about how I think this potential problems, let's say. But first of all, do you just want to explain why you came to advocate for what you call the dirty break strategy?
Yeah, there's a long history in the U.S. of wrestling with this problem, which is that the Democrats are a fundamentally capitalist party. They're the party in which the working class, organized labor, the civil rights movement since the 60s, environmentalists, feminists, all the other progressive forces in society have operated within the Democratic Party, but fundamentally it's a party that is still in the control of capital, and it's a situation that is different from a country like the UK or like Canada, that you all have social democratic or working class labor parties, and as a professor of mine once said, the only thing worse than having a complete sellout social democratic workers party is not having a complete sellout social democratic party, which is the situation we find ourselves in. And so the left many times over the course of the last century has looked that in the face and said, okay, we got to break from these people. We got to make the clean break. We have to, go found that workers' party or that left party or whatever. And of course, as your listeners probably know, they haven't heard about a lot of those efforts because they haven't, unfortunately, amounted to much. Because the U.S. is so uniquely arrayed in its political rules and regulations against such a party. And so many leftists looking at that situation have gone into the Democratic Party saying it's the only game in town. So this is where I'm going to engage. And then they have been pulled, further and further rightward. They've had their progressive politics watered down, and the conservatizing effects of the Democratic Party establishment have successfully squashed their attempt to use the party for left politics. And so the dirty break strategy is an effort to try to it's a third way. It goes between those two ways in which we're sober about what's arrayed against us in terms of being able to found a third party. We're not going to be able to do that anytime soon. We recognize the Democratic Party is the only game in town, and so we're going to engage principally through that party where it makes sense. But we are also going to maintain a level of independence from that party because we recognize that these people are trying to destroy us, while we try to engage in their party. And so, the idea is to have some level of independence from them, and do what Bernie Sanders did in his two elections. I mean, he was an independent. Incredibly, he managed to remain an independent throughout his entire political career. He never joined the Democratic Party, but he ran for president on the Democratic Party line. And through his doing so, showed over and over again how this party is set up to destroy the candidacy of someone like him. There are millions of people now, especially young people, who have looked at what's happened during these two presidential runs from Bernie and seen how the Democratic Party establishment moved heaven and earth to destroy him, and are thinking, what the hell is up with this party? What kind of a left-wing party, party of the people is this that tries so hard to destroy someone like Bernie? The hope is that eventually, sometime, medium term, long term, who knows when, that can lead us to creating an actual workers' party or a left party of some kind, because we desperately need such a party, but it's the barriers towards creating it are so high, and so that's what the dirty break strategy is about: is wrestling with the unique challenges that the American context pose, while also not losing sight of the fact that the Democrats are not our friends.
Mm-hmm. I'll add to that too, just before we move on, that there's actually an anecdote from Bernie's earlier years that is really resonant on this question, which is that he was actually a member of a small third party in Vermont in the 1970s, and ultimately he ran for various offices on this party's ballot line, including governor, I think, and ultimately he didn't win anything, and he eventually left the party. And in his resignation letter, I think sometime in the mid to late 70s, he said that he wanted to leave because the purpose of a the purpose of an independent working class party was to create a political scenario in which the working class itself can rightfully take what belongs to them. And unfortunately, this party was not actually doing any such thing. It was fighting to preserve its ability to stay on the ballot, and it was focusing all of its attention into making sure that it was viable and at least partially visible every few years when an election rolled around. It wasn't rooting itself in the working class. So it was really a party in name only, he ultimately came to believe. There's a difference between when we talk about wanting to have an independent electoral expression, an independent working class socialist party, we're talking about a party with a mass character. We're talking about a party that serves a particular function, which is to heighten class consciousness and facilitate class struggle, not just something that plants the flag and is kind of like around and in people's periphery. So we're working toward that particular goal. And right now we don't have. This is what a friend of mine, Robbie Nelson, always says: it's not a party until there's a crowd. You can create a party, but if you don't have people following you into this party, it's really a party in name only. So what we want to do is use the Democratic Party ballot line where necessary. And it's not going to be necessary in every place. There are different rules in different places, and there are different opportunities in different places to run as an independent or a third party candidacy. But to run open democratic socialists who are antagonistic to capital in general, and that means that they're going to be antagonistic to elements of the Democratic Party, and to use that opportunity to build general consciousness and sort of affiliation with a new political tendency through that process. And that's the only hope that I can see for creating a constituency that we could conceivably break with, right? Because if we don't do that, then all we're doing is taking our ball and going and playing somewhere else, to the great relief of the Democratic Party establishment figures who we've been successfully antagonizing for 5 years now. I'd very much like to continue doing that.
I mean, if I was to make a break, it would definitely be dirty, not clean. But my doubt is more about the break altogether. I suppose a couple of things. So one, given that you admit the barriers are so high to a third party, like I just find it quite inconceivable that you could have a socialist party that would displace the Democratic Party as the major opposition to the Republicans in the next 3 decades or something. So it just seems so unlikely that I feel like, why don't you just throw your lot in with the Democratic Party? Because also, if what you want is to achieve electoral success, not just that, but if what you want is to have your candidates, win Democratic presidential primaries, get into Congress, then does not this idea that we're actually within the party to destroy it potentially lose you some allies? And finally, I mean, you said, Micah, that Bernie's candidacy proved once and for all, or not necessarily, I mean, I'm maybe ramping up what you said slightly, but demonstrated to supporters of socialism that, there's a limit to what you can achieve in the Democratic Party because the Democratic establishment won't tolerate sort of egalitarian policies that challenge established elites. But for me, I'm not sure that's the lesson I've learned from at least the 2020 campaign, because the problem in the 2020 campaign, it didn't really look like a fix to me. It looked like there was a problem that Bernie Sanders' coalition wasn't big enough. And if you get rid of the DNC, that problem is still there.
Oh, well, on that latter point, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, we saw in this primary an unprecedented coalescing of all of the other candidates who were in the race besides Bernie and besides Elizabeth Warren behind Joe Biden in a way that was clearly orchestrated by the Democratic Party establishment. I mean, Biden was doing worse off than some of the candidates who all of a sudden at the same time decided to drop out and get behind Biden to consolidate a single candidate against Bernie Sanders to defeat him. There's the party apparatus has done everything that it can, through the media, through all kinds of ways to try to destroy Bernie's campaign. And it's impossible to know what his candidacy would have looked like without that party apparatus there. But we can certainly point to numerous examples over and over and over again of how that party establishment worked to destroy his campaign. I mean, there are certainly things that we could talk about how we could have made that coalition bigger and the one that actually would have been successful in this primary. But I don't think that we can write off the role of that party establishment. And to the your previous question about sort of the break part of the dirty break. I mean, I think that Bernie did it perfectly, and Bernie did not. Bernie had this level of independence from the Democratic Party, but he also was not saying that he was trying to engineer a dirty break. But in the way that he ran, that had this level of independence from the party establishment, but yet was operating, within the confines of the Democratic Party. He, as I said before, he exposed all of the ways that this party establishment mobilizes to destroy candidates like him. If he had succeeded and won, then who knows what situation we would have been in? Maybe the third way centrist neoliberal types would have been so disgusted with Bernie at the head of their party that they would have gone off and created something like the Lib Dems, a kind of a rump, pro-corporate, socially progressive party. That's where Chuck Schumer would have gone or something. And then maybe the party could have been remade that way. Maybe we would have seen a massive political realignment in this country by huge numbers of Democrats who would say that they just couldn't stomach being in the same party or being in a party that was led by a Democratic Socialist named Bernie Sanders. Obviously, it's impossible for us to know that now, but that was on the table. And I'm open to that possibility in the future. If AOC runs for president in the next election or in 8 years or something, and she manages to make her way to the top of the candidacy in the way that Bernie didn't, maybe we'll get to have that experiment about whether or not we can force out all of the sort of pro-corporate right-wing elements of the Democratic Party. We'll see.
I think that, I agree with Micah that we got to be open to possibilities that we haven't sketched out ahead of time. For one good reason why we ought to be open is that nobody saw Bernie Sanders coming. In fact, I wasn't a member of the organized left or the socialist left prior to this, but I certainly encountered many people who were the moment that I walked through the door because of Bernie Sanders. And what I encountered was a lot of people who not only said that they didn't see this coming, but in fact were denying that it was happening because it just did not square with their view of what was possible. So I think the a rigid sort of orthodoxy or dogma around what's possible in the Democratic Party is probably unwise. But at the same time, I feel like it's probably unlikely that what Micah said might happen would happen, for the very reason that the capitalist class in the United States has a very cozy relationship right now. I mean, they have a very cozy setup right now. It's not quite like in the UK. I mean, like our situation in the US is pretty extreme. It was a Republican strategist who, in sometime in the 1980s or 90s, once said that the Democratic Party was the world's second most enthusiastic party of capital. We essentially have a situation where we have two extremely enthusiastic capitalist parties, and they split the allegiances of the capitalist class more or less by industry. So you've got, oil and gas and defense are going to be Republican stalwart industries. And then you've got on the Democratic side, you've got things like entertainment and tech that are stalwarts. And you've got healthcare and education over on the Democratic side as well. And then depending on where you are, finance and real estate kind of toggle between the two. They kind of straddle that line place by place. So we've got two parties where the capitalist class is split relatively evenly between them. And then, of course, a lot of capitalists will donate to both and try to play both sides. And then you've got a situation where the working class that votes, which is not the entire working class, is also split roughly evenly between the two parties. And they are separated not along lines of industry, but instead along lines of geography, culture, race, nationality. I mean, culture is the big one, the sort of like a cultural sense of belonging that has to do with all of the other stuff. Why on earth would the American capitalist class ever want to blow that up? What a great situation for them. So it seems unlikely to me that if the capitalists are intelligent, they would ever vacate the Democratic Party just because we spooked them by doing good in some elections. Do you know what I mean? So I think that keeping that in mind, it makes me a little less rosy about the possibility that we're going to end up with a major party all to ourselves because we've forced them into retreat. I think they're unfortunately stronger than that. The question that you had, though, Michael, about alienating people by talking a big game about destroying the Democratic Party, I think is an important one. There's a line that you don't want to cross. A lot of we've seen Democratic Party primary voters in particular are not all of them are as anti-establishment as we want them to be. We have to be careful. The general electorate despises both parties, but you have to go through some hoops in the Democratic Party to get in front of them, unfortunately. I think AOC does this well. She's been talking about, she's been hinting at things, saying, if we were in another country, Joe Biden and I would not be in the same party. So she's putting the critique out there, but she's not explicitly saying, like, I'm going to destroy you, which obviously would pose some problems electorally, considering how loyal many Democrats still are to the Democratic Party brand.
It's also, I mean, the same debate which happens in the UK, because we've got a Labour Party which has, generated way more sort of social democratic gains in this country than you ever got in the United States. But it's also, with a sort of blip over the last 4 years, run by a lot of people with close connections with lobbyists and big business and corporates, etc. But the Labour Party is, even if it's, not the most well-respected organization in the country, it's a good brand, right? You want the Labour brand. I want the Social Democrat brand. I feel like if something is big, popular, mainstream, and people have a habit of doing that thing, you want to fight to occupy that space yourself instead of sort of condemn the thing that everyone's already voting for and vacate it, because I just think that creates a bit of an uphill struggle. But we shouldn't dwell on this too much, and it will also come up in the next issue we are going to talk about, which is Bernie Sanders endorsing Biden. Before we get to that, you're watching Navarro Media, you're watching Tysky Sour. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. So please, if you want to continue to support Navarro Media in our growth, we've had a big week this week, partly because of the Labour leaks, which the rest of the media was very reluctant to cover, but which had some real, headline-grabbing announcement for anyone who cares about big stories. So yeah, please go to support.navarromedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Obviously, less than that if you're out of work because of coronavirus, or more than that if you're still getting your income but aren't able to go to the pub. Let's go to Bernie and Biden. So after suspending his campaign to be Democratic nominee last week, this Monday, Bernie Sanders started to heal any wounds with the Democratic Party in an appearance with Joe Biden.
Today, I am asking all Americans, I'm asking every Democrat, I'm asking every independent, I'm asking a lot of Republicans to come together in this campaign to support your candidacy, which I endorse, to make certain that we defeat somebody who I believe, and I'm speaking just for myself now, is the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country.
Yeah, the way Joe Biden acts like he's sort of like really pleasantly surprised is very entertaining in that video. I said the more controversial thing than Bernie endorsing Biden, which I don't think anyone was not expecting, were the words what he said to Associated Press either that day or the following day, which sort of people read in the context of his press secretary, who earlier in the week had said that she wouldn't be endorsing Joe Biden. So that's Brianna Gray, and the Democratic Socialists of America, who said they wouldn't be endorsing Biden. Let's go to Bernie's quote here. So do we be as active as we can be in electing Joe Biden and do everything we can to move Joe and his campaign in a more progressive direction? Or do we choose to sit it out and allow the most dangerous president in modern American history to get reelected? I believe that it's irresponsible for anybody to say, well, I disagree with Joe Biden, and therefore I'm not going to be involved. Before I go to you guys, I'm just going to get up one more tweet. I'm trying to stoke an argument here between these people on American left Twitter. You've got Crystal Ball, who tweets, and so Crystal Ball was one of the most vocal, articulate advocates really of Bernie Sanders during this primary. She tweets, I know the media will never understand this, but this moment right now with Bernie trashing his own supporters is exactly why he lost. He was more committed to maintaining power for Democrats than claiming it for his own movement. I mean, are we looking at some real disagreements in strategy here between Bernie Sanders' base, or is this just a sort of Twitter flame war that we shouldn't take too seriously?
Well, of course, there is a full debate to be had about how how much should we place, should we throw every ounce of our being into defeating Donald Trump via Joe Biden? I mean, like that's a totally legitimate thing to have a debate about. And Bernie Sanders, I mean, as much as we're huge fans of Crystal, she blurbed our book actually, but I would disagree with her slightly there in that I think her argument that Bernie made the endorsement that he did or said the things that he said to somehow appease the Democratic Party. I think that if you asked Bernie Sanders, he would tell you that he thinks of Trump as this unique threat to the United States and wants to do everything he can to defeat Donald Trump. And I don't think he has any love for the Democratic Party establishment. If he would have to have been asleep during his own candidacy and been not paying attention to how that Democratic Party establishment just did everything it could to destroy him. So I don't think that's the question there. I think it's a question of just the defeat of Trump. But, as you mentioned, this is what Bernie said all along he was going to do. It's what he did in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. He made it clear that he didn't want to be seen as some kind of spoiler or something like that. By the way, it didn't stop half of the American media and the Democratic establishment from continuing to paint him as a spoiler and say that he wouldn't stop declaring war on Hillary Clinton, and that's why in many of those people's minds Clinton lost in 2016. It was dastardly Bernie, and if the same thing happens to Biden, I'm sure we'll hear the same thing. But we're members of the Democratic Socialists of America. We think that the DSA refusing to endorse Biden is the right thing to do. It's very strange to me that all of these people who have spent the last year or the last several years arguing against Democratic Socialists, like we're fringe, we're marginal, we're trying to take these politics mainstream, but the American people never go for them. We don't have any power. We're totally useless as a movement. And they've done everything they can to swat us away from the national debate stage. And then as soon as our candidate is out of the race, they're like, well, why wouldn't you? We need you guys in here. Why wouldn't you do this? Like, I thought you just spent all these months and years telling us that we're completely useless and have no power in American society. Like, which one is it? But I think that we should, as DSA members, just speaking as a member, not as a leader in the organization should not endorse people who do everything they can to destroy us, who stand against everything that we stand for. We should not be getting behind a candidate. In the case of Joe Biden, not just somebody who is like a regular old Democrat, not quite a Democratic Socialist, but he's done some good. Like, his actual political record is one that is much closer to the average Republican than the Democratic Party. Every chance that Joe Biden has had over his political career to move rightward, he has taken it. Joe Biden had played a key role, maybe the key role within the Democratic Party in selling the Iraq War to Democrats and to the American people. I'm supposed to just put aside the fact that this man has the blood of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and others in the Middle East on his hands? No, I'm not going to do that. Like, the DSA actually stands for a set of political principles, and we don't endorse people who don't share our political principles. So I'd like to see Trump defeated. If I lived in a swing state, I would vote for Joe Biden. I wouldn't think too hard about it. Just, sure, I'll check that box. But I'm not going to give Joe Biden any money. I'm not going to volunteer time for Joe Biden. And I don't think that others who are excited about the Bernie campaign and call themselves Democratic Socialists should do anything beyond just casting a vote for him in a swing state either.
Yeah, that does make it less. If you're saying just cast a vote for Biden in a swing state, that makes that lowers the stakes a bit, doesn't it? I suppose the argument you could make is that if the shoe were on the other foot, and Bernie had won the candidate, you'd want Biden's people to be voting for Bernie in swing states, but you wouldn't necessarily sort of demand that they, give him their full throttled, enthusiastic endorsement. I want to go to you, Meagan, with a question that sort of relates to something else that Sanders said, which wasn't just that people, in his view, or at least as he's speaking publicly, should get behind Biden. He's saying they should drag his program to the left. Mm-hmm. I don't know, how much leverage does the left have at this point in time to shift Joe Biden, who, throughout this campaign really has been quite clear about the fact that he's the status quo candidate. He hasn't really, to the extent of some of the other centrist candidates, sort of talked up his progressive credentials. What leverage, what chance is there of getting to November this year and Biden standing on a significantly more progressive platform than that which Obama went with in 2008?
There's no chance, frankly. Joe Biden could, I suppose, in some timeline, like if Bernie Sanders decided to hold off on his endorsement for another month or so and kind of play hard to get, it's possible that you could get Joe Biden to make some more progressive sounding noises. But then once it's over and Bernie Sanders inevitably endorses him, which of course he was always going to do and said he was going to do, that'll evaporate immediately, because Joe Biden and his people fundamentally believe that in order to win a general election, you need to run as moderates. That's their theory of how you beat Republicans. You mimic Republicans to take away swing voters. They have no room in their theory for what to do with the left. As far as they're concerned, we are an annoyance and we ought to be scrubbed out of existence. Of course, that's not going to happen. So their analysis kind of stops there. They really don't know what to do with us, except for berate us, really, for not getting on board. I think that, a lot of people are disappointed that Bernie Sanders didn't, like I said, play a little bit harder to get and try to get more progressive things in Joe Biden's platform. Personally, if that happened, I wouldn't believe it for a minute. I mean, Joe Biden is one of the architects of mass incarceration in this country. Joe Biden wrote tough on crime bills throughout the 1980s with Strom Thurmond, who is a staunch segregationist, and then he eulogized him at his funeral. This is a man who said that the N-word race will never be allowed in our schools and our churches in the South, or to paraphrase. So I'm not certain. And this is Joe Biden, who, by the way, this is in Jacobin and Branko Markotich's research, you can find examples of this. Joe Biden would walk into negotiations with Republicans under the Obama administration and voluntarily offer to cut Social Security and Medicare, which nobody was asking for and which was not necessary to win any particular concessions in these negotiation sessions. So if we could somehow induce Joe Biden to tell us that he wanted to provide, I don't know. I don't think we could get him to say that he wants. I don't think we could even get him to say that he wants Medicare for all. But let's say we could get him to say something slightly stronger on that point. I wouldn't believe for a minute that it wouldn't evaporate the moment that he secured Bernie Sanders' endorsement and then marched off into the general election. The reason for that is, like I said, because I think that Joe Biden and his people are really genuinely blinded by a superstition. The Democratic Party establishment is blinded by a superstition that the only swing voters worth courting, the only political bloc worth triangulating around, is suburban moderates, not non-voters, not the very highly politically engaged left. These people do not matter at all. There is one path to victory, and that path runs through suburban Phoenix. So this whole conversation about whether Bernie screwed up, whether he's failed us, whether he's betrayed us by not forcing Joe Biden to negotiate, it seems to me to miss, it hasn't really accounted for the central question, which is why would we trust whatever comes out of that negotiation anyway?
I have to say, I find that depressing conclusion very persuasive. But we're going to segue to the final part of the conversation, or at least my questions for you. We'll go to questions at the end. If you want to ask questions to Micah and Meagan, put them in the comments now, or tweet them on the hashtag #TiskiSour. While we're sort of collecting those, I want to bring up class struggle. Obviously, the point of your book is you use elections partly to galvanize people to enter into extra parliamentary activity, organizing in trade unions, etc. And I suppose the first question I wanted to ask is, I mean, you quite explicitly lay out a strategy, what you call a rank and file strategy. Socialists should be intentionally finding jobs in sectors which are strategic in terms of organizing labor, so logistics. I mean, I'd put cleaning and care in there and stuff like that. It's very, very traditional socialist, or I think I associate with Trotskyism in this country. But I suppose a sort of a practical question, how many young socialists do you think are getting jobs in Amazon warehouses at this point in time to try and provoke strikes? Is this something which theoretically makes sense? It's persuasive as something which would be a good idea to do, but is it actually happening? Is this something which is going on in warehouses across the USA, that you're getting members of the DSA coming in to provoke revolutionary ideas?
Are you a cop, Michael? I feel like you're. It's Jeff Bezos wants the answer to that question.
You don't have to tell me the postcode.
No, I mean, this is something that, I mean, there's a long tradition on the American left and the international left of this happening. And, there's in the US, we have institutions like labor notes that have been devoted to stoking that kind of rank and file militancy within the American labor movement. But, that it's already happening. I mean, I live in Chicago, where maybe your viewers are familiar with what's gone on here over the past decade, which is the transformation of the Chicago Teachers Union into an organization that is a really militant and democratic, fighting public sector union that fights on behalf of the entire Chicago working class, rather than just its own narrow membership. And it does that in part because socialists, along with other class struggle minded teachers, took over that union and transformed it into the body that it is today. And I think that this is something that, that DSA members, young socialists, are already doing in the United States in the kind of industries that you mentioned. They're also doing it, wherever they happen to find themselves. And I think it's important to mention that, it's not like young people, certainly during the coronavirus pandemic, but even in, pre-corona, it's not like young people had this great plethora of well-paid, comfy jobs that they could have gotten, and instead they are eschewing them for jobs in the strategic sector to organize in. I mean, those jobs, those comfy, well-paid jobs, don't exist for our generation in particular. So it's not like people are sort of giving up some kind of great chill life to go slum it. I mean, this is where we find ourselves. People find themselves in the position where they're stuck in often low-paid and drudgerous jobs. And so there are enormous opportunities there. I mean, we talk in the book about places where this is already happening. I mean, in West Virginia, for example, which was where the teacher strike wave kicked off in 2018. Some of the first organizers of the West Virginia teacher strike, which eventually spread across the entire state of West Virginia, and which is a very conservative state, were people who had come together through the Bernie campaign and were DSA members. And then they joined up with other union members to organize for these incredible strikes that took place that really shut down the entire public school system of the state of West Virginia, and then spread like wildfire across the country. So socialists are already doing this, and there are incredible opportunities, I would say, especially right now under coronavirus, because obviously we're hearing about millions of people each week who are newly unemployed. And so those who are still working in key sectors like healthcare, like logistics, actually have an enormous power that it has been magnified by the fact that we now find ourselves in this crisis. I mean, the distribution of goods in this country, in the United States, is a huge percentage of that distribution is happening through Amazon. And so when Amazon workers shut down production at the job, they wield an incredible amount of power. People start paying attention, and they have done that in Chicago, where I live, in New York City, and elsewhere. So the opportunities, especially in the midst of the pandemic, which have really, magnified those who are still working as being really essential to the functioning of society. They've got enormous power, and the only way that we're going to see a response to this pandemic that is not one that is just another massive giveaway to the rich, like we saw in 2008 in response to the bailout, will be if working class people actually take things into their own hands and fight back. And socialists have a really key role to play in stoking that pushback. Not the only role, not even necessarily the most important role, but a very key role to play in doing that. And that's how we're going to see a more just response to the coronavirus pandemic, because we know that Jeff Bezos or Joe Biden are not going to just hand us adequate protective gear and the pay that is commensurate to the risks that workers are taking, or any of that, just on their own. We're going to have to. The extent to which we get that will be through the extent to which there is an actual fight.
Yeah, I'm going to throw my final question from me to Meagan, which is sort of focusing on this coronavirus question. Mm-hmm. You gave sort of in the electoral sphere at least, as I say, a convincing but depressing view of the next 4 years with Biden, who's committed to basically policies of the status quo, or Donald Trump, and we all know what kind of shit show that's going to be. Is there, a part of you where coronavirus and COVID-19 has planted some doubts as to what might be possible over the next 4 years? Obviously, Joe Biden isn't someone who's, personally committed to Medicare for all, but is there a possibility that by November or by the midterms, for example, 2 years after the presidential election, the idea that you can have an advanced developed country where not everyone is covered, is it possible that that just becomes implausible and that the Democratic Party has to shift as sort of what seems politically possible has been transformed by COVID-19?
I think absolutely. And to also clarify something that I was driving at before, I mean, I think that I'm more speaking about the uselessness of negotiating with Joe Biden in this particular slice of time, right before he goes on to the general election, where we know what his strategy is going to be, where I can't imagine him deviating from it. But as a president, there are other avenues for negotiation, or I would say like mounting pressure through extra parliamentary movements. There are other available options to us if he were to become president. And in fact, it would be a lot better than if Trump were president for the left and our prospects, because at the very least, Donald Trump, it's a foregone conclusion. And even Democrats can tell us, right? Democrats are saying, we're not moving on your demands because we can't possibly, because the Republicans are in charge of stuff and they're just completely insane. I mean, look at them. That's the line that we get from the Democratic Party. And it means that essentially we have one party completely hostile to us and the other party also hostile to us, but displacing responsibility onto the former. So if we have a Democrat in the White House and we have a stronger movement than we did last time we had a Democrat in the White House and all the previous times before that, going back several decades, then we, at the very least, we can press our demands, and then they can't tell us that they can't act on them because of crazy Republicans. They have to actually sort of gives the lie to that excuse. And then we have to have a more agitational conversation about whose interests they're actually protecting. And that is a scary conversation because Democrats do actually rely on working class votes in order to win elections. And so you are creating space to agitate in a potential Joe Biden presidency, despite him, I should say, despite his own inclinations. But to answer the coronavirus question specifically, yes, everything's kind of up in the air. Like it's interesting because Naomi Klein wrote this book, The Shock Doctrine, which is sort of about how capitalists and their political allies will take advantage of a crisis to muscle through whatever pre-existing agenda that they had over and over. And we're certainly seeing that in the coronavirus crisis. But oddly, because of the new political possibilities that have been introduced very recently into our political culture, it seems to be a more open question whether or not that's acceptable. I mean, it's like we are having conversations about healthcare, how to make sure that everybody has healthcare to cover their coronavirus related needs. And I'm seeing mainstream conversations happening there where people are saying, well, if it's not good enough for coronavirus, why is it good enough for cancer, right? And that's directly attributable to Bernie Sanders creating the political space to have that conversation. For the last 5 years, that has been his work and that will be his legacy. And nobody could have predicted. Nobody could have predicted that Bernie Sanders, in a million years, I would not have been able to tell you, Bernie Sanders would lose the primary, but the moment that he suspended his campaign would be in the middle of a public health crisis that has also caused an economic crisis in which 10 million Americans just lost their private insurance, meaning that they are now without private insurance in the middle of a public health crisis. It's the stuff of novels, really. And I do think that we will have more leverage because of this incredible disaster. It's a sorry price to pay, you know. It's not a good trade-off, but hopefully I think I'm seeing that maybe perhaps too little too late, but our platform is starting to make sense to people who've been hostile to it historically.
My apologies if I framed your prognosis for the next 4 years as more depressing than it actually was.
It's a 50-50.
Let's go to some questions. Hussein asks on Twitter. Oh, actually, first of all, before we do that, what am I thinking? There's 1,100 of you watching this. There's only 496 likes. Let's get that close to 1,000 before we end this stream tonight. It helps us on the algorithm. It means more people see this video on YouTube, and which means more people learn about democratic socialism, which I'm sure is something you guys are all in favor of. My question from Hussein was, this is sort of his historical explanation. It's been a debate within political sociology for over a century. Why doesn't the States have a trade union funded Labour Party? What's your analysis on this big question? I don't know which one of you wants to take that.
That's a Micah question.
Yep. Micah?
Of course, I'm stuck with this question. I mean, the truth is that I have not engaged in the full historical and sociological debate on this stuff. The U.S. has a uniquely ferocious history of capitalist pushback to workers organizing. There's not a lack of workers organizing. There's a uniquely ferocious attack on that organizing by capitalists. The key period where we could have seen a Labor Party or a Workers' Party or some kind of Social Democratic Party emerge around the New Deal. We had a president, FDR, who was very adept at absorbing the labor movement into his Democratic Party coalition. There's all kinds of historical reasons as to why this is the case. But what's clear is that we absolutely need, when you don't have such a party, you're really left extremely handicapped. And we need to be moving towards one. Whether or not we'll ever be able to achieve it, I don't know. But it's a principal reason why we don't have nice things in this country.
It's a question from Rachel Atwood, #TiskiSour. Plans to push for ranked choice voting as a means to get Green Party candidates and others on the ballot without the spoiler accusation. There's a broader question there, isn't there? Which is, how strongly should socialists in America be pushing for electoral reform? That question always comes with the caveat, which is, nearly everyone wants electoral reform, but it can seem like you're flogging a dead horse when it comes to a popular demand because it can seem so abstract. Do you think Democratic Socialists should prioritize electoral reform in America?
I think so, but not necessarily as a campaign issue because it is abstract to people. And I think only very high information, super tuned in voters actually understand the scope of the problem. But the scope of the problem is extremely real, which is that without electoral reform and without democratic reforms in general, we're going to be consistently stymied. We're talking about potentially making a dirty break from the Democratic Party. There's no hope for this whatsoever unless we can, in our time spent dirtying ourselves in the vicinity of the Democratic Party and hopefully gaining more and more power, unless we can compel some kind of electoral or democratic reform to actually create space for a third party to flourish, then there's no hope. So yes, we need to be doing that, but we also have to get power first because it's not a popular demand. It's not like there's going to be street movement on this. There's not going to be external pressure on this because it's wonky. People don't totally understand it. And people by and large, actually in the United States tend to believe that it's a cocktail of demoralization about what the actual politicians and parties have to offer and a sort of satisfied sense of legitimacy. The elections themselves are legitimate. It's just that the parties suck. And so I'm not sure that there's a strong popular appetite for electoral reform, which means that we've got to just get committed people in there in office who are willing to make that a legislative priority once they've already been elected. We're not going to have mass street protests for ranked choice voting anytime soon. But of course, these kinds of reforms are absolutely necessary.
I didn't realize that electoral reform was one of your preconditions for a dirty break. I'm in favor of it with that context. We
wish that we had gone into it more, actually. Micah, we've talked about this. This is one of the things that we've bemoaned leaving out of the book.
Maybe the paperback edition.
Yeah.
Final question. This is from Kaylee Browncoat. How does the left respond if Trump wins? Very broad question. You can take that at whatever angle you think is most prescient.
Well, if we look at how the left responded to Trump winning in 2016, it was thankfully not to think that Bernie pushed things too far, and thus we all need to line up behind the centrist way of doing democratic, capital D democratic politics. After Trump won in 2016. That was when the Democratic Socialists of America was reborn. That was when we had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar run for office, or the half dozen socialist city council members in the city of Chicago. you know, the left was reborn after Trump winning, both because Bernie ran and showed that left-wing politics actually had some resonance in society, and that people were uniquely, we saw this unique horror of Trump in office, and people understood that centrists were not up to the challenge to fighting that unique horror. And so we're going to have to keep building this movement to orchestrate an effective pushback, because we've seen over the past 4 years that the Democratic establishment themselves are definitely not up to the task. I mean, they what did they spend the last 4 years doing? They did this absurd and idiotic impeachment scandal that I refused to learn a single thing about. Whenever anybody would mention a name like Bill Barr or whatever, I was like, no, I refused to even know who that is. And they, Russia, they were obsessed with Russian interference in the election, all this stuff. I mean, none of that was up to the challenge to responding to the Trump administration's unique horrors that he was bringing. So the response has to come in through building a real left, where we have a great start in doing that so far. We have to keep doing that if Trump wins re-election.
We are going to wrap up tonight's show. Thank you both so much for joining me this evening. Where can people buy the book?
The best place to get it is jacobinmag.com/store or through versobooks.com. They've got it on heavily discount, and I think would probably be able to ship better to UK listeners. Although I'm not positive about that, but yeah, either Jacobin store or Verso.
Brilliant. It's a great book. I recommend it in your lockdown. It's nice, sort of easy read, takes you through a bit of American history, and also, some sort of classic Democratic Socialist, shouldn't put my ideology in your mouth. Democratic Socialist theory of change and theory of state. Tomorrow, it's going to be me and Aaron again with Dr. Sonia Adasara. We're going to be talking about the state of the NHS, how it's coping in this crisis, PPE on the front line. And I think a particular focus on how COVID-19 is impacting people differently depending on race and class. You've been watching Tysky Sour, Win of Our Media. I'm Michael Walker. Good night.